Today we have St. Clement of Alexandria, for whom I have a great devotion. Cards on the table. It's very difficult to be exactly fair to everyone. No one knows everything. Certainly, I don't know everything, and it's easier to be fair to people you know a lot about. But it's also, of course, easy to be fair to people whom you find congenial. I have always liked Clement of Alexandria and his writings, and so it's easy for me to say good things about him. Perhaps I should be doing a better job of defending other people. We'll see. Next week we get Origin, so it's a very different thing. But to begin with, let me tell you something about Alexandria, and then we can move almost directly to looking at Clement's things, because the Clement chapter is very brief, which of course it needs to be. Alexandria in the ancient world was a creation of Alexander the Great. There was no city there before. It was the country of Egypt's window on the Mediterranean, so it was a tremendous port of call for things coming out of Egypt, which produced a lot of grain and of course all the papyrus in the world, and things going into Egypt. Egypt was traditionally the wealthiest country in the Mediterranean world. So everybody, of course, who had anything to sell wanted to sell it in Egypt because they had the money to buy. And it, of course, had a very special culture that went back thousands of years. There are hieroglyphic inscriptions already 3000 BC. I went once to Egypt with my father and older sister, just for about 10 days or 2 weeks or so, 10 days maybe. And it looks just like it does in your fourth grade history book. I was kind of amazed. It's like going to see the Eiffel Tower. It looks just like the Eiffel Tower. And you go to see Egypt, and yep, it looks just like Egypt. A very interesting place. Alexandria was created by Greeks for Greeks to live in. A lot of Egyptians, of course, moved into it. But it was always a very polyglot, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious environment from the very beginning. And so it was a great place for different cultures and religions influencing each other, and for people to go to study. The Ptolemies, all of the rulers of Egypt, Ptolemy, Ptolemy, was one of the generals of Alexandria, and when the empire fell apart, which was immediately after Alexander died, Ptolemy got Egypt, and he set up his capital in Alexandria, and there were 12 Ptolemies in all. All of the rulers of Alexandria were called Ptolemy, and the women were all either Berenice, or Cleopatra, and in the good Egyptian tradition, the Ptolemies married their sisters, which is what the pharaohs did. So they, kept it in the family. Anyway, the Ptolemies had immeasurable wealth, and one of the things they did was found the great library in Alexandria, which was one of the great educational institutions of all time and of the ancient world. It had the largest collection of books, we think, that in the ancient world. There were actually two great libraries in Alexandria, one in the Temple of Serapis, and one in the library itself, which was run by the state, owned by the king. It was, because of that, a tremendous place for education. Alexandria is where the legends say that the Septuagint was translated, was produced, ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament by Greek-speaking Jews. It's where Philo, the very important Jewish writer, was from. It also was, of course, a place famous for the study of literature and history, and it was a place that naturally produced that had a great deal of intellectual life of all different kinds, philosophical and pagan and Jewish and then later Christian, were all running intellectual institutions there. Um, it's not surprising, as a matter of fact, it's what we would expect, that the church in Alexandria seems, and this is all very difficult because we get this second or third hand, but Eusebius, the church historian, talks about there being a school in Alexandria run by the church that seems to have been run by lay people. And Clement is, our Clement, is one of the people who is spoken of as being the head of that school. Exactly how this worked, who was really in charge, who owned the property where they met, stuff like that, we don't know. Hall is one who thinks that Eusebius has, looking back, a century and a half later, that Eusebius has made this more formal and organized and more kind of Greek than it really was. That's certainly possible. It makes a lot of sense. But there does seem to have been something going on. We know that there were schools. We've already spoken of this. We know that there were schools that taught Christianity in Rome. Marcion seems to have had one. We know that Justin Martyr had one. This is not unique to Alexandria, but there are indications that it may have been more that the school of Alexandria may have been more closely tied to the church itself than in Alexandria than it was in other places, which would make some sense. That would fit certainly with the way we hear about it in later sources. As far as we can tell, Clement was for his whole life a layman, a teacher rather than a priest or deacon. And as far as we can tell, he was he was quite close to what we think of in our time and place as being a professional academic. In other words, he taught classes in things that he had previously studied about, that he was involved in running some kind of institution. How large it was, we don't know. Whether he was the only one teaching, which is perfectly possible, we don't know that either. And he also wrote a great deal of things. He wrote his writings, quite a bit of him survives, actually quite a lot. We have what seem to be at least most of, graded progression in Christian thinking. He wrote quite a long apology, which is interesting and good. And then he wrote a book called Christ the Pedagogue. Pedagogue being not a teacher, but the pedagogue was the slave who took you to school. It means a child leader. He took you to school and brought you home and was responsible for your kind of ethical upbringing while the teacher was teaching you, facts. So Christ the Pedagogue is not Christ the teacher who teaches you how to understand the universe, like a super Aristotle, but Christ the person who teaches you how to live a good life. And so his 3-book work, Christ the Pedagogue, which is fascinating, all in English in that volume on your list from Catholic University Press, Fathers of the Church. That book is a detailed discussion of how to go about living a Christian life in an essentially completely non-Christian environment. A big city that had a lot of well-to-do people as well as a lot of poor people in it, and a lot of different options for behaviors and religions and things like that. Among other things, Christ the Pedagogue is an absolute goldmine for people who want to know about what ancient people actually did. He talks about how to go to a dinner party and what's the appropriate Christian way to go to a dinner party. And in order to do that, he has to describe what a dinner party is actually like in detail. And a lot of this stuff is absolutely unique. We know a great deal of what we know about life in late antiquity in the Mediterranean from this one work of Clement. If for no other reason, it's something that everyone who's interested in the ancient church should read, because you can learn a great deal about the lives they were actually living when they were trying to, make them Christian. And then the third part of this process is represented by this work called the stromates, which means either patchwork quilt or woven carpet, some large cloth things that are made by putting together different strands and different weaving or stitching. The idea seems to be this was a genre of literature at the time. It was not one that a lot survives because it tends to sprawl endlessly large, and so they were very difficult to copy over in the ancient period. And modern people people later didn't want to read these huge things. But excuse me. The idea seems to be that Clement is producing something which is, it's not a smooth treatise the way we would think a writer would want to write one. It's put together with lots of different pieces, and it's very discursive. It kind of wanders off over things. This is not the way that Christ the Pedagogue, or Who is the Rich Man Who Will Be Saved, or the Apology are. So this is clearly a choice. This isn't the only way he can write. He chooses to write this work this way. And one of the things is that it's difficult to read. It doesn't sort of flow. But also, it's difficult to make sense of. Many scholars, me among them, think that this is on purpose, that one of the ideas is that when you get to the higher levels of Christian thinking, where the real secrets of the church are being put forward, that these are not things that should be just laid out flat for anyone to see. That if you're going to write down stuff about this, it needs to be done in a way that only initiates, only the people who ought to be reading this stuff will be able to understand this stuff. In other words, it's an example of what we've seen before, the disciplina arcana, the idea that the secrets of the church are to be kept for Christians only. I think that this is what's really going on. It's one of the reasons, of course, that people argue over what Clement's really up to, because when he really gets down to it, it's difficult to make sense of. He doesn't write, a treatise on the Trinity or a treatise on Christology. The way even someone like Tertullian, who in Tertullian in a lot of interesting ways is really a very modern figure, just in the way that his mind works. But Clement is not like that at all. And so I think this is one of the reasons why Clement has been continually undervalued by later groups of people, is because he's difficult and he doesn't fit in. He doesn't produce things that fit into the later categories that the church is using, so the later church has more trouble using him. There's always a premium in the life of the church for writers who produce things that can be used in teaching later. One of the reasons why St. Augustine of Hippo is so overwhelmingly influential in the Western church is that he was a professional academic, and he wrote things that were useful for teaching. And they've been used in teaching ever since. So people grow up with St. Augustine, studying him in school. In ancient times, they read him because he was a great Latin stylist, so they read him to learn good Latin style, and they got his ideas. And everybody's still reading St. Augustine now on Christian doctrine, City of God, on the Trinity, the Confessions, all these things everybody reads. So he's tremendously influential. And people don't use Clement of Alexandria that way because his works don't lend themselves to that kind of use. There seems to have been a fourth part of, well, we know he wrote another work called Hypotyposes, which means something like under types, which may be a sign that it's truths of the Christian church communicated typologically or allegorically. Nothing of this work survives that we know of. So we have no idea how big it was, or, we don't even really know if it's supposed to be a fourth part of the sequence. It would make, if Clement really is this guy who thinks that the farther you go, the more obscure you have to be in order to protect the mystery, then of course having your fourth writing be, having the first one be introductory, the second one be very clear, how to live a good life, the third one be getting more and more abstract, and the fourth one being, absolutely incomprehensible, would be exactly the way you would think that he would go. It would also perhaps explain why we don't have the fourth one at all, because, without Clement there to read it to you and explain to you, nobody could make any sense of it, so it just disappears. I'm not aware, and this is off the top of my head, this is not my specialty, but I'm not aware of us hearing of anybody reading it. So, we hear that he wrote it, but we don't hear that anybody read it. So it must have been a classic, because nobody reads classics. Okay, and he also wrote a book called Excerpts from Theodotus, which is a very interesting book. It's, in an age before photocopying and stuff, people would read treatises that they wanted to, gain access to, and write down important quotations from them, like a Cliff Notes version that you would make for yourself. Theodotus was a non-Christian philosopher, and the excerpts from Theodotus is Clement's notebook that he made, copying out the parts of Theodotus that he thought were relevant and also commenting on them. As a Christian observer of a non-Christian argument, it's both a way of passing on Theodotus's argument, here is what he says, and also a way of commenting on it to make clear where he thinks it's inadequate and not to be followed by his students. It's very interesting that a work like that survives when the Hypotyposes does not. I don't know what to make of that. The excerpts from Theodotus is not endless in size. It's a separate volume. That. $250 pages in a modern edition. So anyway, let's. There are a few things to say before we go on. Clement seems to have been an adult convert to Christianity. He seems to have had a classical education. It's very difficult to say a good classical education about anybody in the ancient period, except someone who is really a very upper class person. We don't know really anything about his background, so it's difficult for us to know what was being done to him when he was 8 years old. But he seems to be very well educated. He can write good Greek when he wants to, which is a hard thing to do. And as far as we can tell, he lives to be about 60, we think, and he spends virtually all of his life in Alexandria in academic pursuits. We think he was from Alexandria. At the very end of his life, it seems he may have fled a local persecution and gone to Palestine, which would have been safer at that point. If it would have been easy to get on a ship, because Alexandria is a big seaport, and that he went to a place which is safe. Origen, we will see next week, also flees Alexandria to Palestine. It's an obvious place to go to. It has a large Christian population. It's also an academic center, so someone like that would find it, attractive. We don't know much after that. Apparently he dies there, or he dies soon after. And so we are. Now, one of the things which is also difficult for later people to handle with Clement is that Clement uses the term Gnostic as a term for an advanced Christian. Remember, Gnostic means that someone who knows, a knowing person. And for Clement, who is a lifelong academic and a teacher, someone who knows something is a good thing. In the modern period, we think of Gnostic as it's a scare word. Don't be a Gnostic. Clement is early enough so that Gnostic doesn't mean non-standard, anti-Christian thinker. Gnostic just means a knowing person. And so he is perfectly aware of the fact that there are a lot of people around claiming to be Gnostics. He's not agreeing with them. He talks about a true Gnostic or a Christian Gnostic. And we will see that in some of the writings we read. But it's very important. Clement is, again, off the top of my head, almost unique among writers of surviving Christian works from the early period as one who has his own use of the word Gnostic, which is not what everyone else uses the word to say. And because of that, you need to know that going in, or you can't understand sometimes what he's talking about. I think this is another factor that has made the later church nervous about him because, we know he doesn't really mean what everyone else says, but still, he's calling himself a Gnostic. Just as a note, one of my grandmother's good friends in Houston, older than she was, but still, and my grandmother graduated from college in 1912, so this woman, I don't know, would have been born about the time of the Civil War. And she was from a very well-to-do family. Her husband was one of the people who made a huge fortune in the early oil boom in Texas, even before, maybe right at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And this woman, who lived to be of immense age and lived in a huge mansion in Houston, always considered herself to be a communist. And my mother always used to say, everyone would try to explain to Mrs. Sharp that what she meant by communist was not what everyone else meant by communist. And they never got, I guess if you're a fabulously wealthy old lady, living in the deep South, if you've got an idea, you stick with it, and everyone else has to change to agree with you, because she never gave it up. But you would not understand Mrs. Sharp if you thought that she was like Stalin, because she wasn't. She was more like Mrs. Rockefeller, but called herself a communist. So, anyway, on that note, we're going to look at a number of these things, and we actually have some time to actually look at them. So we will. Here I'm in selection 156 on page 200, the Church in Alexandria here. The Pantinus. Now, we actually know a little bit about, let me tell you what we know about the school in Alexandria. We are told that the school in Alexandria exists for multiple generations. We are told that early on it has this man named Pantinus, who is a convert to Christianity as an adult, who seems to be one of the teachers of Clement. And then Clement is a teacher of Origen. Origen lasts for quite a long time. Then after that, I don't think we know names of heads of the school in Alexandria. But by the time you get to the next century, so 100 years after Clement, 20 years after Clement, you get to Athanasius being a young man in Alexandria. And he seems to get, from what we can tell from reading his stuff, he seems to get a Christian education. So that's generally assumed to be in this same school. Whether or not it's in the same location, whether or not it's, as we would say, institutionally connected to the earlier stuff, we have absolutely no way of knowing at all. But it's interesting to know that for all of the ancient period in the church in Alexandria, really till the coming of the Muslims, there does seem to be constantly available organized Christian instruction in doctrine and Bible and things like that. In Alexandria, on a level that most places can never offer, and Alexandria seems to have constantly present. And more than that, we really can't say much. But so Pantinus is interesting. This is again Eusebius, so this is, secondhand, and maybe Eusebius is making this sound more permanent and impressive than it actually would look to us if we looked at it. But he's trying to, for Eusebius, Origen is the great hero of the early church, and he's building up to Origen. So first he's got Pantinus, and then he's going to have Clement, and then Origen. Okay. There was a man of great renown for learning named Pantinus who had charge of the school of the faithful at Alexandria, where it had been a primitive custom that a school for sacred study should exist. Well, we've talked about all that. And the school has continued even to our present day. So, as we know, Eusebius is, of course, fully bought into the story that he tells us. But anyway, he, although we understand it was filled with men of great learning and zeal for divinity, it's recorded that the said person, Pantinus, was especially distinguished, inasmuch as he had come from that sect of philosophers who are called the Stoics. In late antiquity, the period that we're looking at, about the year 200, the Stoics were the philosophers of sort of greatest influence and renown. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, is a Stoic. Seneca is a Stoic. People like that. Cicero is a Stoic. Okay. Now it is said that he displayed such ardent love and zeal for the divine word that he was appointed as a herald of the gospel of Christ to the nations of the East, and that he journeyed even as far as the land of the Indians. There was trade back and forth between southern Arabia and the coast of India and Egypt in the ancient period. We know that. It's been demonstrated over and over and over again. So him traveling from Alexandria to India is certainly not impossible. We do know of people who did it in both directions. Whether Pantinus did it is another question, but it's interesting. It tells you something about what people thought intellectual people did in Alexandria. Let's keep going. There were, yes, even still at that time, many evangelists of the word, desirous to contribute in inspired zeal after the manner of the apostles. So there were still people traveling around as teachers at that time. Pantinus was one of these, and is mentioned as having gone to India. And the story goes that there he found in the hands of some persons who had come to know Christ in that land the gospel according to Matthew, which had anticipated his arrival. For that Bartholomew, one of the apostles, had preached to them and left behind the writing of Matthew in the actual Hebrew characters. This is the famous passage that we talk about sometimes in New Testament class, the passage where someone says that somebody else says that he saw the Gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew characters, and this is what people who say the Gospel of Matthew is originally written in Hebrew is based on. And we could talk for half an hour about this question, but there are too many different things going on, and you notice that the person writing has never seen it. It's never we never hear anyone say, "Oh yeah, I saw that." It's all, "Oh, I heard about a guy who had a friend and his college roommate's sister and had this boyfriend who, and at that point you wonder what you're really being told. So I have lots to say about that, but that's a problem for another day. Okay, so it's interesting that it tells you something important about Alexandria, that discussion of an academic, which is of all careers the most sedentary, would contain a discussion about the interesting places he went and the people he met there, because that's not what academics usually do. Usually they sit down and read, right? Which is why a lot of people don't want to be academics, because they don't want to sit down and read. Okay. The next one, 157, the teachers of Clement of Alexandria. This is Clement himself writing at the very beginning of his Stromates. This work is not a writing artfully composed for display. It doesn't look fancy the way people write fancy treatises, but memoirs which I've stored up against old age, a remedy for forgetfulness, an outline sketch, stuff like this. Of the clear and living words I was privileged to hear. So first thing to know is he is presenting this as his presentation of what he had been taught. right? This is his passing on of the tradition. That's very important. He is not claiming that he's creating, look at this great new idea I have about God. That's not what he's doing. One of these, the Ionian, was in Greece, others in Magna Graecia, which could be Sicily, southern France, southern Italy. Others in the east, one from the country of the Assyrians, yay, Mesopotamia. The other were Hebrew by origin and Palestine. I fell in with the last of these, who was the first, having run down my quarry. This is usually understood. This is usually understood to be a reference to Pantaenus, the last of these, but the first in ability. That he traveled all around and he settled with Pantaenus as his final and ultimate teacher, which may well be true. Okay, so that's interesting. Important to know that this obscure work. This does say, by the way, that there are, you notice in the little note at the bottom of 157, selection 157, it says that the hypotuposes is extant only in fragments. I didn't remember that they were fragments. I don't know how many there are. Okay, here we go to 160. The word our pedagogue. Very important. Christ is the Word, right? The Word means speech, the Word means reason, Word means knowledge, Word means understanding, expression, all of these things. It's not surprising that he speaks of Christ as the Word when he's speaking of Christianity or education in Christian terms as preparation for a Christian life. So it's a very appropriate choice, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He could have said, I am the door. He could have said, Christ is the door, but of course that wouldn't fit, the image of his work. Okay, I guess it could be the door into the school. Our superintendence in instruction and discipline is the office of the Word, from whom we learn frugality and humility, and all that pertains to love of freedom, love of man, and love of excellence. So, in a word, being assimilated to God by a participation in virtue. If you live a good life, you will be closer to God and you will be more like God. Assimilate means made more similar, right? The imitation of God is as I think we may have said, certainly in the New Testament it's very clear, the original command for Christian ethics is be like God. Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And that's what he's saying here. Interesting to see how traditional and also how scriptural he is in a completely non-scriptural form, right? So, in a word, being assimilated to God, we must not retrograde into carelessness and sloth. Labor and faint not. That's a good Bible thing, right? Thou shalt be what thou dost not hope and canst not conjecture. You can be, greater things than you can imagine. There is one mode of training for philosophers, another for orators, another for athletes. So there is a generous disposition suitable to the choice that is set upon moral loveliness resulting from the training of Christ. In the case of those who have been trained according to this influence, their gait in walking, their sitting at table, their food, their sleep, their going to bed, their regimen, and the rest of their mode of life acquire a supreme dignity. For such a training as is pursued by the Word is not overstrained, but is of the right tension. It doesn't task you too much, but it keeps you working and training. Very important and interesting to see that one of the basic ideas here is that the Christian life is one of the things you can work on. Western Christians, especially after St. Augustine, tend to want to say it's all grace, we can't work on it, God just gives it to us, not noticing, of course, that St. Paul, the person from whom we think we take that idea, is a great one for talking about training in Christian life. Asceticism. I strive, but not as one beating the air. All of this. sports training metaphors that St. Paul uses are all talking about working at being a good Christian. This is very Pauline, this is very biblical, though in the West this tends to make us nervous. Eastern Christians don't have any trouble with this. But it's very interesting to see this. He the basic logic of writing a series of treatises that people can work their way through is, of course, that trying to be a good Christian is something that people can and ought to work at, intellectually and also practically. I can think of no treatise in the history of the church that's more practical than Christ the Pedagogue. It tells you what kind of clothes to wear. He thinks that stuff matters. Okay. Now, of course, he is trained in philosophy and teaching people philosophy, so he's going to talk about this a little bit here in number 162 on page 205. Philosophy then, before the coming of the Lord, was necessary to the Greeks to bring them to righteousness. But now it is profitable to bring them to piety. Philosophy is still profitable, seeing that it is a sort of training for those who are gaining the fruit of faith for themselves by means of demonstration. For God is the cause of all good things. See that right in the middle of this paragraph? But of some primarily, and as of the old and new covenants, and of others consequentially, as of philosophy. In other words, he's saying God directly inspires the scripture and indirectly inspires philosophy by leading people to think good thoughts and have good ideas. This is actually also very much like something you could see in Romans. One of the things this does is a passage like this, which is in the Stromates, right, for the advanced people. One of the things it does is it shows that the question of whether or not philosophy is a good thing has arisen. And of course, it's an important thing in an academic situation where philosophy is one of the basic subjects of instruction. So one of the things we see going on here is that Clement is going to argue that you do not have to stop being what you were before in order to be a Christian. You can think of what you were before, say someone studying philosophy and trying to live a good life according to that, as fulfilled in the gospel, so that the gospel is not a rejection of other good, but a fulfillment of other good, which also, remember, is very much like the early chapters of Romans. It's interesting again because Western Christians are much more ready to see conversion as rejection than conversion as fulfillment. Eastern Christians have traditionally and culturally thought of conversion as fulfillment. And Clement, as far as that goes, is very much an Eastern, very much a Greek Christian instead of a Latin Christian. Tertullian, trained in philosophy himself, said, is a what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Nothing. Clement would never say that. Tertullian said it, but doesn't seem to have believed it, or at least not acted on it. Clement would never have said it. Okay. So having talked about how knowledge is a good thing and helpful to Christian existence and living, then number 163 here is going to talk about a Gnostic. Well, what's a true Gnostic? Remember, just to remind you, because this is important, especially modern Christians, the Reformation happens in the modern period, especially modern Christians in the West, tend to think of conversion as, I didn't used to be and now I am. I was, when were you, the whole idea like when were you saved, and that you were saved kind of all at once and now it's over. That idea, which doesn't fit very well with the Bible, for a lot of American evangelicals, is the only proper way of talking about this kind of thing. It doesn't seem to allow for a lot of progress in faith and understanding happening after conversion. You're either converted or you're not. And once you are converted, you're saved. It's kind of over. You're saved. That's a completed thing. Clement clearly is thinking of Christian life as a continuum. And remember, he's an adult convert as far as we can tell. A continuum that where development continues, and that's a good thing. And so he's trying to, these are all for a Christian audience. Certainly the pedagogue and the stromates are for a Christian audience. And he's trying to encourage and assist people who want to make progress in their Christian living. So, here, page 206. The man of understanding and perspicacity is then a Gnostic. And his business is not abstinence from what is evil, for this is a step to the highest perfection, or of the doing of good out of fear, nor any more is he to do so from hope of promised recompense, but only the doing of good out of love for the sake of its own excellence is to be the Gnostic choice. Okay, so this seems to be, he doesn't specifically say right here, but this seems to be a kind of, steps up the ladder. Abstaining from what is evil is a good thing. You want to abstain from evil, but that's not as far as you can go. Doing good out of fear, doing good because you're afraid of God or you respect God, it's good to do good, but that's not the best reason for it. Doing good from hope of promised recompense, doing good because you want to go to heaven, that isn't necessarily the best thing either. Better than being scared to be hoping for heaven. But the best is doing good out of love. Love, of course, would be your love for God and God's love for you. So you would be doing good because of the relationship you have with God. You would be in a loving relationship with God. This is a mystical picture. You would have a, love in this case, you would have an unspoken and perhaps unspeakable yearning to do what God wants because the fact that he wants it makes it what you want. In the same way that if you have my cousin's son had a baby whom we're going to meet for the first time tomorrow, Oliver. And I haven't seen Oliver yet, but his mother, I am sure, is absolutely committed to giving Oliver exactly what she wants as soon as she can figure it out because of her concern for Oliver, not because if she didn't do that, I would certainly feel in my heart condemnation for her. I hope I wouldn't say, maybe I hope I would say something depending on what it is, but I wouldn't think that would be what drives her concern for my opinion, but rather love for Oliver, right? After all, she is, in the roughly equivalent relationship to Oliver that God the Father is to us. Okay. Now, that's not as hard a thing to say as now that we're all like, male versus female, everything's all tied in knots. People get nervous about saying something like that, but the ancient church, certainly the ancient Eastern church, didn't worry about that stuff. Okay. So in other words, I'm not being in the slightest bit non-traditional by saying that. Okay. Now, in the person of God it is said to the Lord, ask of me, and I will give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, teaching him to ask a truly regal request, the salvation of men without price. On the contrary, to desire knowledge about God for any practical purpose, that this may be done or this may not be done, is not proper to the Gnostic. You don't want to know about God so you know, can I buy myself a raccoon coat and wear it to the football game, right? The knowledge itself suffices as the reason for contemplation. The Gnostic, the person who knows about God, wants to know God because he wants to know God. In other words, God is his goal. Drawing closer to God is his goal. He doesn't want to draw closer to God to do something, to use it for something, to benefit in some way. He wants to draw closer to God so he can be closer to God. That's the goal of the... So in other words, it is desire for God in a pure sense, in the sense that it's not alloyed with anything else. Okay. I will look opposite number 3 here. I will dare aver, claim that it is not because he wishes to be saved that he who devotes himself to knowledge for the sake of the divine science itself chooses knowledge, for the exertion of the intellect through training is prolonged to a perpetual exertion. The perpetual exertion of the intellect is the essence of an intelligent being. Could we then suppose anyone proposing to the Gnostic whether he would choose knowledge of God or everlasting salvation? If these, which are actually the same thing, were separable, he would choose knowledge of God, because he would want to be, rather than, he would not choose salvation, which is something for himself, he would choose to know God. Knowledge of God and drawing close to God that's a religious goal. And so it's very interesting that, because Gnostic, the term to us sounds like he's making Christianity an intellectual puzzle. And here he's specifically saying he's not. That if he had a choice between being saved and drawing close to God, that his goal is the mystic one of drawing close to God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The Christian Gnostic is exactly wanting to be the person who's pure in heart, who sees God. That's what he wants more than anything else. And that's a tremendously powerful picture. And also, I think, in its own way, a very traditional picture, though of course expressed in a very different way. But he's living in and is the product of a very particular place in the early church. There isn't any other place that we know of that's like Alexandria. So it may not be surprising that they produce people who speak differently than people in other places. Okay. There's always more to say about everything. Let's look at number 165 on page 208. Faith and knowledge. Still Stromates, book 7. Faith in is a compendious knowledge of the essentials. So if you have faith, you know all the basic stuff. But knowledge is a sure and firm demonstration of the things received through faith. So first you have faith, and then the knowledge comes after that, after you sort of fully understand what faith teaches. Faith teaches you that God is your creator. Knowledge teaches you what that means. Knowledge is the understanding that comes from knowing, what does it actually mean to say that God is my creator? Okay. Being itself built up by the Lord's teaching on the foundation of faith and carrying us on to unshaken conviction and scientific certainty, as I mentioned before. There seems to me to be a first kind of saving change from heathenism to faith. First you go from paganism to faith, a second from faith to knowledge, and this latter passes on into love and begins at once to establish a mutual friendship between that which knows and that which is known. And perhaps he who has arrived at this stage has already attained equality with the angels who dwell with God. So this is how it works. This is the steps up a ladder, right? First you are a pagan, then you have faith, you're granted faith, and so then you believe, say, that God is your creator and the father of you and everyone else, Jesus Christ too. After being at the faith level, you gain through instruction and also grace and other things, experience, the sacraments and life in the church. You gain, say, an understanding of what it means that God actually is your creator. Sure, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Great, but what does it mean to say that God is the maker of heaven and earth? As you come to understand what that means, that draws you into love, because you begin to appreciate the relationship that God has with you. While we were yet sinners, still he loved us, right? God is already being your creator and having this particular relationship you're learning about before you even acknowledge that he was your creator. And because of that, you respond to that knowledge with love because you understand what's being given to you and offered to you. So you progress past the point of just understanding into a place where you have a personal religious relationship with God. At that point, of course, that's why you see the Gnostic, the guy who knows, who has knowledge, it develops naturally into love because of what it is you are gaining knowledge of. You can see that rather than turning Christianity into a puzzle, it's a way of talking about how Christianity can be a mystical religion that is based on every individual's attempt to come to know God, and still, at the same time that it teaches this, the possibility and desirability of this mystical relationship, it also includes instruction. Here you are, you're Clement. You spend your whole life teaching, and one of the things you think about is if everyone's saved through grace, by faith, by grace we are saved through faith, not of us. It is the gift of God. I used to think this when I was teaching college. When I would get 100 papers a week, maybe 4 of which would show that the person was a sentient human being. Why am I doing this? If everyone's saved by grace, why don't I just go do something else which would be more fun? And it's hard to think of something at that point that isn't more fun than what you're doing. This is the teacher's question. Maybe this is why I've always found Clement so attractive. Clement has a sense of the mystical nature of Christianity, but also a sense of the fact that human beings, despite the fact that this is happening through grace and with God's assistance, human beings do make steps through the process. It is we're running the race, but that means we put one foot in front of the other, and that's how we get somewhere. And those can be difficult ideas to hold together at the same time, because oftentimes we think of them as mutually exclusive. I don't think they are mutually exclusive. Certainly the church has always had instruction in it, and it's also always preached salvation by grace. So the church as a whole has not thought of these things as mutually exclusive. There's no question that there are a lot of people, again, particularly in the Western tradition, who have had real trouble explaining why they were doing what they were doing if they thought what they thought about grace. When I began this, I wasn't thinking of making this I'm not trying to set Clement up as an anti-Luther, because I don't think he is. But it's interesting stuff to think about. I'm reading a book about an Anglican Puritan at the gym, so I'm William Perkins. So I'm thinking about Calvin and Calvinists and Calvinism and things like that. So maybe that's all coming out in the wash. Okay, we have 2 more. 7 more minutes. 166 here at the bottom of 209. Okay. Church and heresy. Clement's living in a situation where every imaginable possibility of philosophy, religion, everything is there on tap. So there are people all around the city who offer every possibility there could be. It's not like being a Mormon in Utah where, I don't want to be a Mormon anymore. I want to be a Roman Catholic. And then you got to try to find a Roman Catholic to help you. There's no trouble with that in Alexandria. So the question of what to do with people who are members of the church but then begin to exhibit signs that they have very different ideas. What do you do about that? What then? If someone is guilty of breaking his engagements and neglecting his agreement with us, shall we let go the truth ourselves on account of him? If other people, should we just follow other people wherever they go? No. The good man must be true to his work and not belie any promise, however much others may break their engagements. We have to do what we think is right, no matter what everyone else does. We ought in no way to transgress the rule of the church. As the note says later, the rule of the church is really like the rule of faith, what is going to develop into the creed. This is a very traditional statement. we ought in no way to transgress the rule of the church. He's holding for the Christian tradition. Above all, the confession which deals with the essential articles of the faith is observed by us, but disregarded by heretics. Those then are to be believed who hold firmly to the truth. Using this defense broadly, we are now entitled to reply to them that physicians also, though holding different opinions in accordance with their schools, are still all engaged in the practice of healing. The problem is, as the note makes clear, in a situation in Alexandria where there were different groups, like groups that we would call Gnostic, saying, we Valentinians, we're the real Christians. The division among groups that proclaim themselves Christian becomes an apologetic problem as well as a problem for people who belong to the church, right? It's one problem for people who belong to the church. What if they live closer to the Gnostic Valentinians? Should they go there? They say they're Christian too. Why not go there? It's closer. No, you argue they're really doing something different. Another problem is non-Christians, if you're trying to interest them in the church, say, why should I go to any of you Christians? Since you don't agree on what Christianity is, then there's no way for me to know that any of you are right. It doesn't seem like there is a real thing such as Christianity, because you people who are supposedly doing it don't even know. You can't agree. So I'm not going to pay any attention. And that's where this argument about the different schools of thought among doctors, just because there are different schools of thought among doctors, nobody thinks that you ought to not go to any doctors. I mean, you try to find a good one. And so he's trying to say, no, don't turn away from us completely, right? What we try to do is here, this bottom paragraph on page 210. It is for this reason, therefore, that we need more attention and consideration to determine how we should live with strictness and what is true piety. We need to know how to live a good Christian life and what it is that should be our true and correct religious opinions and beliefs. Right? It is evident that the trouble and difficulty of ascertaining the truth have given rise to questionings, from whence spring vain and self-willed heresies, when men have not learnt nor really received knowledge, but have merely got a conceit of it. We must therefore spend more thought in searching for the very truth, which alone has for its subject the very God. In a time and place where there's disagreement, this is the answer of our church, right? In an age when Christians have real trouble agreeing on what even the most basic tenets of the church are. I mean, there are a lot of Christians around in the United States publicly who say, Trinity, who cares? Incarnation, who cares? Sin, what's that? Who cares? The response is not to give up. The response is to work harder and try to understand better. And then to try to put together a Christian life, living with strictness and true piety, and so in that way to embody what it is you are trying to offer to people, and so therefore be able to attract them by doing that. And in our last 2 minutes, that brings us directly to this next little treatise on number 167, The Rich Man's Salvation. Very interesting. It's a treatment of the man who has kept all the commandments and then comes to Jesus and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, give your money to the poor and take up your cross and follow me. And he goes away sad because he's got great possessions. And the question is, does everyone who has possessions have to give them all away in order to get into heaven? And Clement, this is a treatise which can be read in its entirety, I think, as the classic Christian answer. It is, to my knowledge, the first treatment of this that survives. One of the things it shows, of course, is that he had at least some people in his ken who were well-to-do, and so for whom this was a question. His answer is not that only people who give up all of their property can go to heaven, which is also not Jesus' answer, I would say, but rather that this is the first place we see the idea explicitly used in the church as opposed to Gospels of being a steward, right? The idea that you are given control of some of God's goods on earth, and you are a steward for God, then in the strictest sense, they do not actually belong to you. You are in charge of them, but they are part of God's creation, not your stuff. And so they are a part of your trying to live a Christian life. In other words, if you are a rich man and there are poor people in the church, you don't just go to church and pray with them and for them and treat them nicely and do all the other things that poor people do for each other. You also have a moral responsibility to use your wealth to do good things, because it's God's wealth in the end, not your wealth. This answer becomes so standard in the church that we almost can't see it anymore. We almost are not aware of it anymore. But it's a very interesting treatise. It's interesting that he wrote it because it tells us something about the character of the congregations that he knew. And it's interesting, of course, that it survives in its entirety, because that tells us that this was something which was used and useful and was convincing when he wrote it. So I commend to you Clement. You notice, by the way, he has a Latin name. Clement is a Latin name. I've never heard of anyone who could explain that. He may have been the Clemens gens, the Clemens clan in Rome in late antiquity was very wealthy and large, and he may have been a freedman, an ex-slave, or descended from people who'd been slaves of theirs. Maybe that's the easiest way to imagine someone with a Roman name being a Greek living in Alexandria. But anyway, I commend him to you.